So before we get into the actual lesson for tonight, I want to go through and show you a little bit of one of the presentations I learned at the Swiss symposium this past weekend. It was um, a health and fitness symposium that I went down to Columbus for. There were like 50 or more presentations on different topics. A lot of it was around coaching athletes and strength athletes in particular, because Elite FTS was one of the main sponsors and organizers of the event. But there was a lot of great stuff in rehab and treatment and nutrition that I learned a lot from too. And one of the presentations that really stood out to me that I enjoyed a lot was one on burnout, and kind of going into the question of, is burnout real? And then looking at some data around the physiological responses that we have in our bodies to burnout. So I wanted to very quickly, without getting too much into the sciencey bits of this, go through and just showcase this because it relates to what we're learning in the stress management success course. Obviously, burnout is one of the big things that we are seeking to avoid and mitigate with managing stress better and becoming unstressable. And so, in this presentation by Dr. Mike Militek, I believe is his name, he is actually a neuropsychiatrist somewhere up here in Canada. I think he went to McGill for school, and I'm not sure where he's at now, but I think he's still in Canada. He studies and works with a lot of professional athletes and has this data around their hormonal and their neurotransmitter responses to stress leading into burnout. And basically, what he said was, with the stress response, as we know, there is an adaptive there's an adaptive purpose to that, with it being used for being able to combat something, whether it's a threat perceived or real in our environment. And ultimately, stress moves us forward. It creates that action, that fight or flight. It allows us to do things. When we reach a point of burnout, we are so depleted that we no longer are able to mount that response, not just mentally, as a lot of people experience, brain fog and a lot of those symptoms that come with burnout. There's also a neurochemical response, a real physiological response to burnout that depletes us as well. So, what we're quickly going to look at here is how burnout works, um, with a couple of key things. So, I'm not sure if you can see where my mouse is pointing on here, but I'll just kind of describe it as much as possible. This is the stage one of indications that burnout is eminent in somebody. What we see is, and something that's useful to know as far as stress goes, and we've talked about the stress hormone cortisol. He, Dr. Militek, is looking at urinary cortisol, as that would be a reliable indicator, especially if measured at certain times throughout the day, of what's going on with the cortisol response in our body, because that's excreted in the urine, as well as there's a correlation with any kind of excretion of neurotransmitters. The main one that really stands out being dopamine, which is part of that sympathetic nervous system response, or that fight or flight action. And dopamine is the molecule that motivates us to take action. So when we see a response with dopamine, it's because our body is telling us to do something. And we often hear about dopamine when it comes to like the reward molecule, but it's actually about craving and desiring more. And that's why it's more about the motivation molecule when it comes to like social media and getting the swiping through, seeing who's liked your status or your post on social media. We get a small hit of dopamine because it's motivating to repeat the same behavior to get the reward again. And that's one of the powerful things about social media in particular, is that it's a random, it's very much so random when we get that dopamine response or that hit, because not everybody, we don't always get the same likes or the same rewards every time we post something. So there is that inherent level of randomness to social media that makes it extra addictive in terms of the neurochemical response that we see from it. But so in the stage one, what we see, this is the early stages of burnout, where the individual that was being measured here, we see a heightened urinary cortisol level in the normal time frame in the morning, where we see cortisol spike. So early morning cortisol spikes, typically within this green um, range that is indicated on the graph. In this first stage, we see the spikes actually off the chart high with cortisol. And then throughout the day, what happens is that cortisol level doesn't come back down to normal range, but stays elevated. And there's also in this first stage a heightened dopamine response outside of optimal range, which also means something is becoming unsustainable long term. And I'll just quickly go through this all because it is, we could talk about it more if anybody's got questions, but it's just kind of helpful to know. And I'll summarize some of the takeaways that I think are important after we go through it. So stage two, there's already there's a lacking cortisol response first thing, or actually it's probably just based on how many samples that they took of the individual for the morning, but cortisol is lower first thing in the morning than would be expected, but then it spikes again to a much higher range and then fails to drop off to normal ranges towards bedtime and into the night again. On the neurotransmitter side, we still see things like dopamine and the other excitatory neurotransmitters are very high outside of normal ranges. And same with epinephrine being heightened. Epinephrine would, same as like adrenaline, is basically like our adrenaline response starts to go on overdrive to make up for the fact that cortisol is not normally being the cortisol response is not normally being mounted as it should be throughout the day. He didn't have a slide sharing the same sort of things for the stage three, but what we see at this point is that cortisol is already extremely high in the morning, and then it's to the point where the individual can no longer even have a normal healthy cortisol peak to get you up and going in the morning, and then it just starts to be in that lower state throughout the day, but it's also not dropping off as well either, so it's not clearing from the system. And on the flip side, stage four, he's only got the slide for the excitatory neurotransmitters, and we start to see that cortisol's no longer being mounted properly throughout the day. That hormone cascade is completely depleted, and now we're starting to see the depletion of the excitatory neurotransmitters that can no longer keep up with trying to compensate for the lack of cortisol response. So that's ultimately what happens with it. And the problem there being that obviously we no longer see our normal hormonal profiles throughout the day, and that leads to many other issues down the road. Cortisol, when it becomes in that prolonged elevated state also leads to things like loss and basically eats away at parts of our brain, um, and destroys our hippocampus, so we can't form long-term memories. Part of why we see brain fog with burnout. Excuse me. And then we also would see the issues with the depletion of the fight or flight neurotransmitters, or the like dopamine is obviously going to uh, drop our mood, our ability to motivate ourselves to take action and do things. And that's where there's just that state of depletion. And with burnout, not feeling like you yourself, not wanting to do the normal things that you like to do. This is obviously important, not just in athletes. This is what Dr. Militik's specialty would be in, is understanding the issues surrounding burnout when it comes to sports performance and athletes and what they're trying to do at a peak level. But we all need to recognize this. And a few things that are helpful to know: I don't think that, and most of us can go and get our blood tested, especially 4 or 5 times throughout the day, to see what our cortisol is doing throughout different times a day, or even look at excitatory neurotransmitters in the urine. I don't know how that would even, I don't think that's a typical test that we could even get unless we were in a specialized lab. So there's not that side of it, and that's not the important thing to take away, but more so knowing that there is this component. um I'm also going to think about how can we restore things like our neurotransmitters. There are certain things in our diet, particularly dopamine, can be replenished from eating more of like the protein, fats, and lower carbohydrates. um and then like with cortisol, how we can kind of manage that. Having enough fats in your diet is a helpful thing for maintaining the production of cortisol, but we also want to be mindful of what we're eating there too, in order to manage our cortisol levels and not abnormally spike them to the point where they become out of our typical alignment throughout the day too. So just a little bit of side note on that, and the science behind burnout. It is a real thing. There's lots of articles out there that saying that burnout's not real or it's all in our mind. But there is a clear hormonal cascade that happens in the state of burnout that leads to these issues that need to be ultimately corrected through things like better stress management and taking small steps to make those changes, which is what we're going to be talking about today.